Este webinar está presentado por el capítulo regional de la Acoustical Society of America, llamado Spanish Speaking Acousticians in the Americas. Vamos a tener esta pequeña introducción en español y después el webinar va a ser presentado en inglés y vamos a tener traducción simultánea. Para acceder a la traducción simultánea, por favor utilicen el botón que dice interpretación y ahí pueden conectarse. Para hacer preguntas pueden usar el botón Q&A y el chat para hacer cualquier comentario. Bueno, les voy a contar un poco para los que no saben qué es la Acoustical Society of America. Es la sociedad científica más importante a nivel internacional que trata temas de acústica. Su misión es generar, diseminar y promover el conocimiento y aplicaciones prácticas de la acústica. Hoy en día la Acoustical Society of America está llevando adelante una iniciativa para ser más diversa y tener y ser más inclusiva. Entonces, por eso capítulos como el nuestro son apoyados por la Acoustical Society of America para llegar a más personas en distintos lugares del mundo. La membresía para ser miembro de la Acoustical Society of America es bastante reducida para estudiantes, de solo $50, $125 para asociados y $50 para miembros que están en países en vía de desarrollo. Los beneficios son las publicaciones, los beneficios de ser miembro de la Acoustical Society son las publicaciones como el prestigioso Journal de la Acoustical Society of America y la publicación Acoustics Today, que se publica regularmente en 3 o 4 veces por año. Y también asistir a las conferencias con descuento. La misión de este capítulo regional Spanish Speaking Acousticians in the Americas es de conectar y congregar a los profesionales y estudiantes de la acústica y el sonido en el área geográfica de América Latina y actúa como nexo entre las personas, los acústicos que viven en estas zonas y que hablan el idioma. No sé, la pantalla completa, Dios mío. Que ven estos temas que están trabajando en estos temas para conectarlos con la Acoustical Society que está en Estados Unidos. Somos el segundo capítulo regional por fuera de los Estados Unidos y el otro fue en el sudeste asiático. Está abierto a todos los acústicos de habla hispana, pero especialmente aquellos en países de América Latina. Algunos datos de nuestro capítulo: fue establecido en diciembre del 2019, tenemos unos 167 miembros en 18 países, el 24% son estudiantes, un cuarto de nuestros asociados son estudiantes, y tenemos miembros en todas las áreas técnicas, pero predominantemente en acústica arquitectónica, engineering in acoustics y noise, que es el tema de ruidos. Y nosotros queremos que más profesionales que trabajan en otras áreas de la acústica también puedan presentar sus investigaciones y conectarse con nosotros. Tenemos una página de Facebook que es la que ven ahí, y también una página web en la cual pueden saber sobre nuestras actividades. Para hacerse miembro del capítulo no hay que ser miembro de la Acoustical Society y no tienen que pagar ninguna membresía, simplemente conectarse a ese link y unirse. Siempre estamos buscando nuevos miembros que quieran trabajar en la junta directiva. Eso es algo que se hace, los miembros que estamos en la junta directiva lo hacemos en forma ad honorem, sin pagar, sin recibir una contribución, y es un trabajo voluntario. Si están interesados en participar en la comisión directiva, pueden escribirnos ese mail que está en pantalla. Tenemos algunos ciertos eventos en junio, vamos a tener un panel de consultoría de ruido y también un panel de acústica de instrumentos musicales por parte de Héctor García Mayén, que es un investigador que está en Francia, haciendo un doctorado, creo, que trabaja sobre acústica de instrumentos musicales. Bueno, queremos agradecer por el apoyo de estas empresas que nos apoyan: Playtech, Owens Corner y Wang, que son empresas que nos apoyan y nos han dado contribuciones económicas para nuestro capítulo. Bueno, nuevamente quiero decirles que a partir de ahora el webinar va a ser en inglés. Si quieren conectarse a la traducción en español, pueden apretar el botón que dice Interpretation y ahí conectarse. Y nuevamente, si quieren hacer preguntas, pueden hacerlo por el Q&A. Y bueno, ahora vamos a pasar al inglés y voy a presentar a los panelistas que tenemos hoy. Well, so now we switch back to English. We'll start by presenting our distinguished panelists we have today in this panel discussion on restaurant acoustics. So ladies first, I will start with Dr. Lily Wang. She's a professor, she's an enormously accomplished acoustician. She's a professor at the Durham School of Architecture, Engineering and Construction, and Associate Dean for the Faculty of Inclusion and the College of Engineering at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Dr. Wang started her career at Princeton University, where she obtained a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. Then she moved on to Penn State to get her PhD in acoustics at the graduate program in acoustics at Penn State. We can say in a sense that Dr. Lily Wang is my academic grandfather, because she was the advisor of my advisor, who's Dr. Vijon. So she's my academic grandmother in that sense. Her research focuses on a variety of room acoustics and noise control topics, including human perception and performance in noise, uncertainty in acoustic measurements, and room acoustics computer modeling, as well as obviously restaurant acoustics. Dr. Wang is a fellow of the Acoustical Society of America, a board certified by the Institute of Noise Control Engineering, a professional engineering license in acoustics through the state of Oregon. She has received numerous awards during her career. She received the ASA Hunt Postdoctoral Fellowship. This is a very prestigious fellowship. The Bruce Lindsay Award, also from the Acoustical Society of America. The Ralph G. Nevins Physiology and Human Environment Award from Australia, and the National Science Foundation Career Award. She has served as president of the Acoustical Society of America in the period from 2018 to 2019. She has also been the president of the Acoustical Society of America between 2015 and 2016. And she has served as the chair of the Technical Committee of Architectural Acoustics from 2004 to 2007. And on top of this, Dr. Lily Wang is a mother of two, so she's a pretty busy person, you can say that. So our next panelist is a personal friend. His name is Greg Scott. He's the founder of Soundprint, which is a very successful application for smartphones that works through crowdsourcing and empowers users to search places, dining spaces mostly, based on how quiet or how loud they are, using the application's decibel level meter. He's also a sought-after presenter and resource in the audiology and noise awareness communities, where he has spoken in several conferences, including the Acoustical Society of America, the National Hearing Conservation Association, and the Hearing Loss Association in America, and he currently lives in New York City. So he's also welcome when the pandemic stops to taste the Argentinian food, which I know he's a good fan of Argentinian food. He has been in Buenos Aires before. And last but not least is our third panelist, whose name is Pierre Germain. He's a Constellation Design Manager, Senior Acoustic Engineer at Meyer Sound Laboratories. He has over 14 years of experience in the design and tuning of the Constellation System. He has played a pivotal role in the design, acoustic testing, analysis, tuning, and commissioning of the flexible acoustic environments in several world-class venues, including something not very far away from where I'm here now, the Teatro Municipal Las Condes in Chile, the Fons Navag Concert House in Norway, and several other world-class venues where the Constellation System has been implemented. He was also instrumental in the restaurant applications of Constellations, and he will tell us today about that, and including several restaurants in the West Coast in California, including Como in Berkeley and Verse in LA. Prior to joining Meyer Sound, Germain has spent 7 years at acoustic consulting firms, Val Acoustics in Canada and San Francisco, Shen, Milson and Wilke. And Pierre Germain has a master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of British Columbia, specializing in acoustics. Today we'll have a moderator who is one of Dr. Wang's students. He has recently graduated from the University of Nebraska with a thesis on the acoustics of restaurants as part of the architecture and engineering department He has studied acoustics there. His research, as I mentioned, focuses on predicting noise level in occupied restaurants and the validation of new acoustical metrics. And well, we see him here with his dog. He enjoys in his free time fencing, fine good woodworking, and walking his dog. So without further ado, we'll start the panel discussion. I leave now. I will let Jared start with the topics, and thank you all for being here. Goodbye.
Lovely, thank you, Fernando. So we'll get started off with a question for all three panelists. Question is just basically, why are restaurant acoustics any special or different than other branches of acoustics? I'm sure we're all very familiar with the overall field, but I want to start off by talking about why this branch is special. Greg, why don't we start with you?
Me?
Yeah, Greg. Yep.
Yeah, I'll start this off by saying, although I'm involved in the acoustics and founder of Soundprint, my technical expertise is definitely lacking compared to this audience. So just keep that in mind. I will rely on the colleagues on the panel to fill in the more technical aspect. But from our perspective, the acoustic for restaurants and to some degree cafes and bars are different than the other venues a lot of our users measure, because people tend to have an expectation of socializing in restaurants and being able to converse and hear with other people. It's a place for connection and conversation with others. And that's why I think there's such a variety in expectations when patrons visit restaurants versus other venues, such as a loud spinning gym or maybe an arena or a sporting stadium.
Pierre?
Yeah, for us, it's mainly because restaurant acoustics, when you hear the term acoustics, people gravitate towards, concert halls and music and whatnot. And here we're not looking to enhance music quality. It's more to create just a pleasant space for conversation, but also to just feel that you're in a social environment, right? That's the whole reason where you go out to a restaurant is to go out and be in public. So you want to have that right balance of still hearing the conversation across the table, but also just having that level of privacy that you feel that you're kind of like in this bubble of activity around you. So it's a delicate balance.
Lily?
I don't have much to add to what Greg and Pierre said, but I would just second that, yes, that it often is that we have to look to the use or purpose of a space to understand how the acoustics should be designed. So it's different for offices versus schools versus museums. And as both Pierre and Greg have said, restaurants are a place where you are going to connect and gather and socialize, but at the same time, you don't really want to hear everybody else. I mean, you want to hear some sense of excitement, but then also hear your own conversations with your group. So balance, as you said, Pierre, balance is really important here, that you want both of them to be sort of happening in a way, and it is problematic, so that it is a problem. Restaurant acoustics, that achieving this balance is not easy.
And then, so what are the goals for restaurants, more objectively? We just kind of talked about it subjectively just now, but are there any specific objective metrics that we could try to aim for when we design them? Start with you again, Lily.
Sure. Yeah, definitely we don't want it to be too quiet, right? Because if it's too quiet, then it becomes a speech privacy problem, that I can hear what's happening, all the details of the argument happening at the next table or the proposal that's happening 3 tables down. So we really don't want it to be too quiet where others can hear our conversations, but then that balance is we don't want it to be too loud. And there are so many factors in the restaurant that can affect what the end balance is. Reverberation time is certainly one, how long the sound lingers in the space. And there have been people researchers who have proposed guidelines and actual metrics that I think is dangerous, because reverb time is just one aspect of the restaurant. So there is one article that suggested 0.5 to 0.7 seconds in restaurants, which is about the level we recommend in classrooms. But in my opinion, actually from your thesis, Jared, right, we measured restaurants, some of them were up to 1.8 seconds. And were they really uncomfortable? It depended. It depended on what was the ambient noise. Did they have music? Did they have TVs? Is there kitchen noise, cooking noise? What was the shape and the room size and the materials in there? What kind of seating is there? How dense is it? Do they have tables, benches, booths? What dining style is it? You know, in Asia, it might be more group dining, and that will maybe impact it as well. And then, of course, occupancy. Maybe there's only yourself in the restaurant versus having it be very crowded. So I think it's difficult as we talk about restaurant acoustics and how to try to set guidelines, and that it's a combination of all these effects that will impinge on what conversation level I'm hearing versus the noise level that I'm hearing.
Sure. Pierre, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Lily explained it very well. Yeah, the topic of setting a specific reverberation time, it can really vary, and it really scales with the size of the restaurant. Because if you have half a second in a normal sized restaurant, that could be really pleasant. But if it's half a second in a very large restaurant, you're going to feel like you're in an anechoic chamber. So yeah, like Lily said, it's that right balance of you definitely don't want to be too quiet, because then it's kind of like the cinema experience where you're sitting down to watch a movie and you can hear every little bubble gum wrapper that's getting open. You can localize, your ears are really good at figuring out the direction of where certain sounds are coming from. So I found that in those really quiet restaurants, people tend to start talking quietly because now they feel like they're in a library. So yeah, again, it's finding that right balance of something that still feels lively. If there's background music, obviously you don't want that to be too reverberant, but you also don't want it to be too quiet. So I think it really scales, and like Lee said, if it's a party restaurant, maybe it's okay to have it a little bit louder, but if it's a quiet kind of dining place, then we want it quieter. So it varies.
Greg, do you have anything else to add?
Don't have much to add other than to state the fact that different restaurants have different goals. So there are, especially at least in some of the urban cities I visited, some of these restaurants promote the loud noise. They think people have a more exciting time. Some people like the loud noise because they're accustomed to it. So that's one thing, is some places like to be quiet. If you compare a restaurant today to like 40, 50 years ago, or talk to patrons who visited restaurants 40, 50 years ago, they are surprised in the comparison by exactly how loud these restaurants have gotten. It used to be, according to them, that the restaurants was really a place you went to eat and to have a conversation. And now there's been a huge pro-entertainment factor that's been put into a lot of these venues, along with the architectural changes. And then the other thing is we focus a lot on the sound level, like quiet, moderate, loud versus very loud. But one of the goals is probably just using the word optimization. A place can be loud and you can still have a pleasant dining experience, a pleasant acoustical experience if it's optimized based on the acoustics. So there's also that distinction between those two.
Very good. I'm going to pose this next question to Lily, to Dr. Wang, but the other two of you feel free to interject if you have anything else to say. What research has been done recently in the field? Where is the academia sort of headed?
Yeah, I feel like there's been three main categories. There's been a lot of studies that look at basically taking measurements and observations of the conditions in restaurants. And so there's a whole list of those papers that we could reference. A second category is the impact of a restaurant's acoustic sound field on human perception and human behavior. And that includes taste. I think that's been interesting. I read about a lot of that in your background chapter of your thesis, Jared, right? Like understanding how the sound levels or soundscape in restaurants could impact perceptions of taste as well. The third category I'd say is prediction, which could be helpful in the design process. So can we predict what the sound levels or the sound environment is going to be like? And those predictions, sometimes they're predicting occupant satisfaction. There have been researchers who've looked at that. Or let's predict the maximum number of talkers that can be in this restaurant, like an acoustical capacity, like Jens Holger Rendell has proposed. Rendell also proposed even a step further, not just a maximum number of talkers, but the quality of that verbal communication. So and getting to that point that we've already talked about in this panel is acoustic comfort. That, you know, could be loud, but are you still able to acoustically comfortably have this conversation? And there was a recent article in the Acoustics Today published by ASA by Roy and Seabine, where they suggest that maybe we should have classification systems like they do with ski slopes, you know, that there could be a black square for this one, or I'm sorry, I'm not a skier, so I don't actually know the skiing classifications, but you know, that there could be something similar to talk about, hey, you know, can we predict and then actually maybe also validate and have some kind of classification. In our own research group, which Jared does know quite well, having participated that, you know, we're very interested in doing a large scale measurement campaign of many restaurants and to log sound level data, log occupancy, log all the conditions of that restaurant that might impact the quantities that will determine what the sound field is like. And then we've been using machine learning methods and statistics to help identify patterns and relationships in that data, because we are interested in validating and refining these predictive equations, and then using that data to help the community hopefully develop a restaurant design guideline or standard.
All that research sounds very interesting, doesn't it? Greg or Pierre, do either of you have anything else to add about research that either of you have done or been involved with for either of your products?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Greg.
Okay. One of the things we did with Soundprint was basically, it wasn't the intention of when we created the app, but what ended up happening is we were sitting on a treasure trove of data based on linking audio to venues. And so when we realized all this data we have, we started making our data available on a case-by-case basis to public health research and acquisitions. And one of the things I worked on with Dr. Wang was we wanted to create a benchmark for what the average sound levels were in New York City for restaurants, for bars, and for coffee shops, and determine a whole bunch of other variables associated with it, because there was no evidence of what a typical sound level was. And I believe we did something along the lines of 2,000 to 3,000 restaurants in New York City alone, and figured out that the average decibel level was something along the lines of 77 to 78 decibel. But more importantly, we discovered that in certain neighborhoods, 50% of the restaurants, not bars, were endangering the hearing health of patrons and employees. So that's some of the research we've done. And one of the motives behind encouraging people to take more and more submissions is to create the databases for public health, noise pollution, and acquisitions who want to use the data for academic research.
Very cool. Thank you. Pierre?
Yeah, we haven't done any formal research on restaurants, apart from, you know, we've worked on, I think, 8 restaurants now. And what we do is we regularly follow up with the restaurant owners just to see how things are going, how they're using the system, and just kind of like what have they noticed in terms of trends with clientele and whatnot. And what we've seen is that they tend to have a lot of repeat customers, because I think we've all had the experience of walking in a restaurant. If it's too loud, you leave and you might not go back, no matter how good the food is. So I think that's been something that's been very encouraging. And also just, you know, comments, you know, bumping into somebody on the street saying there's only one restaurant in Berkeley that I can go to and hear myself, and that's the Kamal restaurant that we worked on. So I think, you know, it's just kind of a lot of, you know, kind of positive feedback, and you know, if there's any adjustments that we want to make, then we obviously kind of apply to future restaurants.
Good. Yeah, I think there's a lot of research that could benefit from following up more than they do, to, you know, get more data points in time, for sure. Pierre, Greg, will you tell us the beginnings of Soundprint? What really inspired you to do this? What kind of created this idea for Soundprint?
Sure. So I live in New York City and I have hearing loss, and I was dating in New York City, trying to find quiet bars or restaurants to take my dates. And this was particularly important, obviously, because I have hearing loss and it amplifies sound and it's confusing, but also women tend to have, for me, higher frequency sounds, and it makes it harder to understand. So it elevated the importance to find quiet spots. And I would go to Google, I would go to Yelp, I would go to OpenTable, I would go to Foursquare, and I Google, like, you know, quiet restaurants on the Upper East Side or quiet restaurants in the West Village. And then I would go to them, and almost 90 to 95% of the time, none of these places were even remotely quiet or even moderate. They were just blasting with music, or they were just poor acoustics. And so out of curiosity, I started taking decibel meters and just measuring sound levels and creating these so-called quiet list of places where I could reliably go to when setting up dates. And then I had friends, those with hearing loss and those without, kept asking me for these quiet lists. And I was visiting home to San Francisco Bay Area. My mom wanted to have dinner, and she said, where would you like to go to dinner? And I said, someplace quiet. And she said, where? And I didn't know, because I haven't lived in the Bay Area for years. And that's when I thought, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we all could take up the same consistent decibel meter, crowdsource it, and then help fulfill a database that helped other people find quiet places and avoid noisy ones. And so that's kind of basically how the app got started.
Very cool. And then how long ago was that? How long has the app been?
Sorry, the app we launched in, I believe, May of 2018. And it got a lot of press. And I think it got a lot of press because for the first time, there was a very easy to use portable tool that the mainstream public could use to advocate for hearing health or voice their complaint with their submissions that places are too noisy for them. And we got a lot of emails where people felt very empowered, and the story resonated a lot with journalists. And so we ended up getting a lot of press, and then the app and the story kind of took off from there.
Very cool. Thank you. Pierre, will you do the same thing? Tell us about the beginnings of Constellation. What kind of inspired you and your company to do that work?
Yeah, first restaurant we did was in 2012. The inspiration came from John Meyer, the founder of the company, who was kind of experiencing the same issues in restaurants that everybody else had, that, you know, everything was very loud, couldn't hear the other person at the other side of the table. And we had already started adapting Constellation for other uses besides music venues. We've done, you know, some obviously performing arts venues, black box theaters, that sort of thing. And we started adapting it for boardrooms, for voice lift applications, that sort of thing. So John wanted to see if there's any way we can use Constellation to kind of tackle the restaurant noise problem. So the first restaurant we did was Kamal here in Berkeley, and we kind of approached it like we would any regular Constellation system by adding a lot of passive acoustic treatment to really dampen down the reverberation time. And we intentionally overdid it. We actually got this restaurant down to about 0.4, knowing that with Constellation, we're going to bring that energy back. So that's what we did. And it's an L-shaped restaurant. So we did it with 2 different zones. And it worked out really well. And what we were able to do was create different presets based on the occupancy. So when the restaurant opens, it'll be in a low occupancy mode, which will actually make the restaurant a little bit livelier, will actually increase reverberation. And then as it fills up, they can go into medium occupancy or high occupancy, which will gradually bring that level down. So that way they were able to gauge, you know, based on the occupancy, how lively they want the restaurant. And also they have one area that's a bar that's a little bit more lively, and they want to keep it that way, versus the other part of the restaurant which has banquets and more kind of quiet dining where people want to talk to each other. So they're really able to kind of control both levels of both sides of the restaurant. And then at the same time, they can use those speakers for background music as well. So that's how it started, and it picked up a lot of steam and a lot of interest around the Bay Area. And
very cool.
Really great. Yeah.
Will you might have given a little bit there at the end, but will you just give a base summary of Constellation System for anyone in the audience that might not be familiar with that type of system?
So it's an electroacoustic system, consists of microphones, loudspeakers, and digital signal processing. So the processor has a digital reverberator that you can set to any room. So you think of it as a couple chambers. So think of a concert hall where you can open these big doors to increase the volume to get more reverberation happening. In this case, the couple chamber is now an electronic reverberator. So the microphones will pick up the sound, the ambient sound of the restaurant, and goes through this reverberator, It comes out of the speakers, and then that process regenerates itself, which is how reverberation works in any room. It just reflections keep bouncing around. We just couple it with an electronic reverberator to actually make it sound bigger. So we've been able to, take a small theater and make it sound like a concert hall or a cathedral. So in this case, for restaurants, obviously we don't make it sound like a cathedral. We just make it sound like a more kind of pleasant environment, so that you can still have that conversation at your table, but the background is kind of blurred by the reverberation, so that you know that there's ambience around you, but also helps with the privacy and providing some level of masking using the other conversations in the room.
Do you think Constellation could be useful in every restaurant, or are there specific use cases which limit the implementations?
The only limitation is we want to have at least a 10-meter distance in one direction, and that's just to get the right mixing of all. Because what we do is we blend all the signals together to kind of create that blurred ambience, if you will. So that's the only limitation. The only other limitation is it's always easier to do it in a new restaurant as opposed to a retrofit, because retrofit, they have to close the restaurant or close part of it, and that gets more complicated. Just like any construction project, it gets more expensive and more complicated to retrofit a restaurant. So if a restaurant owner plans for it in the beginning and budgets for it, then it makes it much easier. But apart from that, there's no limit as to the style or type or size of restaurant, apart from that, the small size.
Okay, very cool. There's a question in the Q&A from Zachary for you, Greg, asking about the Soundprint app only shows a single dBA level, but under the hood, are you able to see spectral differences from restaurant to restaurant in either 1/3 octave bands or octave band levels?
Yes. I can speak in layman terms as opposed to technical acoustical terms. The output that we show is the one output variable of whether it's the max, minimum, or the average sound level taken throughout the measurement. But behind the scenes, there are frequency line graphs that do measure throughout the measurement, and we do have that data. So the answer is yes, but it's not. We don't make it public or available to the public for people to see. But it could be used potentially. We started storing those for the purposes of research at some point.
Okay. My own personal question: do you have issues with the calibration of phones between devices and things? How do I know that my device is properly calibrated to take those measurements?
So calibration is probably the biggest issue. Luckily, with the iPhone system, there's a lot more consistency between all the models and all the devices. They typically tend to use the same microphone, the same standard, the same operating software. So when you calibrate for one device, it makes it easier to calibrate for future devices. There is going to be some difference between devices. It's just the nature of what it is. It's not perfect, but it's pretty approximately darn good. The issue we have, the real big issue, is with the Android operating system. There are so many different Android operating devices. There's no standard across the different Android models, and it picks up things that the iPhone doesn't pick up, and it can be very sensitive depending on the different Android device. We've spent a lot of labor-based hours trying to come up with a good calibration for Android, and it's been frustrating, and we've released a limited calibration for select Samsung devices earlier this year. We did not really do a big push behind it. And then we tried the Pixel, but the Pixel was getting very difficult to calibrate. So the answer is, for iPhones, it's very good to calibrate. The Android is much more difficult, and I give a lot more latitude to the approximation in the Android devices, especially on the decibel level, below 60 and below 65. Above 70, it does a pretty darn good job, but there are always going to be issues of calibration. It's not, I always caution people never to use Soundprint for legal purposes, but more for approximation purposes.
Very cool, thank you. So what are the biggest challenges in this branch of acoustics? And we've kind of answered this question a little bit, touched on it a whole bunch. To your perspective, but what are the challenges? Start with you again, Lily.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think we're making headway on gathering data and getting research done, and of course, if we are going to get to a point, which I would love for our community to get to that point where we have a standard or guideline for design of restaurant acoustics. Those are all difficult, but in some ways, I think more straightforward than I think the most difficult part, in my opinion, is adoption. Adoption of that restaurant guideline or standard, or convincing a broader swath of restaurant owners or operators to care about that. I already see that in all kinds of areas that we work in noise, that we can get the data, we can maybe make a guideline, but then that last part of full adoption and deployment, that's what I think is going to be the most challenging. We still got a lot of work to get to that point, but.
Pierre?
Well, biggest challenge is just kind of raising the awareness of acoustics as an important part of a restaurant. You know, I think as a new restaurants gets developed, you know, the first two things they think is obviously the taste and the smell, but they also have to think of, you know, the aesthetics, and then sometimes the aesthetics will compromise the acoustics. And we've seen in recent years just a trend of going towards the industrial look, you know, concrete, wood, plaster, just kind of making it rough, which are all very reflective materials, which result in a loud restaurant. So I think it's the same challenge we have with all acoustics, is just kind of raising the awareness that there are these acoustic materials, that there are materials that can look like concrete, look like wood, and so on, that may be a little bit more expensive, but are worth it in the long run, because then it's once you build something and you start opening a restaurant, and it's too late to kind of realize that, oh, I should have thought of the acoustics. So I think it's just raising the awareness.
Greg?
Yeah, I think there's two different things from our perspective. One is a lot of people don't appreciate is that different people have different noise sensitivities. So a lot of times we'll get emails saying, well, you said that this number means it's loud. I thought it was pretty quiet. And then sometimes you get the same number from somebody else and they think the exact opposite, where a place is quiet, but it should be loud. And so there's also, I don't think people have an appreciation for the different noise sensitivities and how different people experience noise, which is why we use both the color coding and a decibel number so people can make up their own choice. But I think Pierre really hit it on the point. I think getting acoustics more mainstream, but it's not just acoustics, it's why acoustics are important. And that's, in my opinion, for two reasons. One is, I don't think people realize the impact of noise-induced hearing loss. Hearing loss is definitely an issue that's on the rise, and a lot of people don't think about it. There's a lot of delayed results when you start listening to loud music. You listen to music on your iPhones, or you're an employee in a restaurant, you know, in your 20s, and then maybe, you know, in your 40s or your 50s, and your 50s and 60s, you start to lose your hearing and you don't know why, or you just think it's due to aging as opposed to cumulative noise exposure. And I think if we raise the awareness of the impact of loud noise on patrons' hearing health, employees' hearing health, their own hearing health, as well as a pleasant acoustical experience, and we back that up with data. I'm biased here, but I'm just speaking from my experience. We show them that data that these places are too loud, that this is not normal. You make venue managers more aware of it. And when we give the option for users to take the measurements and submit noise complaints, and the venue manager sees it, or they hear from us, or we connect them with the acoustic supplier or people in this audience to go contact them, all of a sudden it becomes much more important to them, and they probably won't think of noise after they created the restaurant. The ideal state is for them to start thinking about the design from the beginning, which would demonstrate on the mainstream that they're taking acoustics more seriously.
Very cool. I'm going to take a minute to, audience members, if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the Q&A for us, and we'll try and get to those here in a second. Love to hear what you have to ask and have to say. We're going to move on here to recent trends in the restaurant industry regarding acoustics? This question can be for all of you. We can start with Pierre. Do you have any perspectives on what restaurants are, starting to do with regards to acoustics? New restaurants and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, it's just kind of a continuation of my previous point. I think I have seen some restaurant incorporate acoustic treatment, and in many cases they can be really nicely creative about it. It doesn't need to be a specific acoustic panel that you buy from a panel manufacturer. Somebody create a really nice kind of woven fabric with some absorption behind it, and I think people are starting to kind of catch on. You can always tell which restaurants kind of figured it out after the fact, because they might just have a couple of little small patchwork and they have the right idea. And in some cases, they just might not have enough treatment. You really want to have a good, at least 50% of your ceiling, if not more, and that sort of thing. But I'm still seeing a lot of restaurants that just go the other direction and go for that industrial look. And those are the ones where you see more people congregating on the outside patio because it's quieter than inside. So I think it's just, like I said, just making, if you're working with consultants or restaurant owners, just making them aware that addressing it early on or right at the beginning of the project is really key.
Sure. Greg, have you noticed anything changing over the course of your time with using Soundprint and everything?
So in terms of recent trends, first of all, I'll just reemphasize that there's a long-term trend that continuing, more places are just continuing to get noisier. On the other hand, with the demographics and the baby boomers who tend to have more disposable income, they're starting to make their voice heard more, complaining about the noise. So that's kind of one trend. The most recent trend, which is something a user highlighted to me in an email, was about COVID. And that is, when a place is noisier, you have the Lombard, the cocktail effect, where things are noisier, so people start talking louder. And then when you start talking louder, you're more likely to possibly transmit the virus. So I thought that was the most interesting recent trend I heard, was there's another health aspect to noise, and that is, if a place is quieter, people are less likely to transmit the virus. I just thought that was really interesting.
I think so too. Thank you for sharing. Lily?
Yeah, I was going to, I definitely trend more towards the academic, although I am a user of restaurants, so rather than a designer of restaurants. But I would continue on what Greg mentioned about COVID, that I've certainly been thinking about. I've not been to a restaurant since March 2020, and I am, although there are restaurants open here in our state of Nebraska, but I'd be interested to know how the trends are going to work with de-densification because of COVID, and also increasing outdoor seating. It's going to be interesting. Yeah. I can't look into a crystal ball to know, but I would predict that those things are going to maybe continue and have some impact.
It definitely would be nice to have a crystal ball sometimes, wouldn't it? Let's go on to my last kind of closing questions if we don't get any more Q&A from the audience. Pierre, what accomplishments in this field are you really most proud of?
I would say the proudest would be the most recent restaurant that we did, which is called Verse in Los Angeles. And the reason is it's kind of 3 rooms in one. And that's where, with our system, can really kind of transform spaces into spaces that they weren't normally thought of using. So it's primarily a restaurant, just kind of a big rectangle, but they can also convert it into a little small concert hall. So they'll take the tables out and put a stage at one end, and now you have yourself a performance venue, and they can have different presets for that. They can make it sound like a jazz club if you want, make it sound like a little rock venue, or turn it off if it's really loud. And then they can also use it as a recording studio. So the owner is also a recording engineer. So he can actually bring in a drum set in there and then put in a nice 1.5 second reverb time and do some recording in there. As well as, can also use the microphones that are part of the system to feed the recording as well if you wanted to. So I think that one worked out really well. It starts out really dry. It's a really pleasant environment when you're there for dining. Plus the food is amazing, which always helps. So I think that one, just because it's such a versatile space, I would say that would be the proudest achievement.
Cool. Greg and Lily will get right back to that question. I've got one question from the audience here. From Josh Theed. He asks, what role can consultants, architects, and engineers play with regards to restaurant acoustics?
Well,
I
would
can
say,
start because that
yeah.
that actually was part of what I was thinking about my proudest achievement. So I can maybe tie the two questions together. I feel like we all have a role to play, and it's important for all of us to play that role if we're going to move the field of restaurant acoustics and advocating for healthy hearing for the general public. The role that I think for myself is as a science researcher. So I can help, I have the time, and that is my job, to do research and get data to help support guidelines and standards that we might develop that then the consultants and architects and engineers can point to say, okay, this is important. Let's get a constellation system, but this is really, we need to be doing. So there's a role for all of us, and we're all working in collaboration, I feel like, to make gains in advocating for the hearing health of the general public.
Greg or Pierre, do you have anything else to add to that answer?
Role-wise, for this particular audience, I would just go about what are the ways, always think about how we can raise awareness of why acoustics is important and how it impacts people's hearing health. I think that's a social mission I'm driven by, but I think it helps the industry overall if we make light of that. And if you're in a noisy place, advocate for yourself in a nice, gentle way to tell the manager, inform them, like, are you aware that this place may be too loud for you and could be damaging your ears? And I do that all the time. And I'm surprised by, not at this point, but initially I was surprised by how often people working in these restaurants had no idea that the noise levels were damaging to their ears. And once you told them that, they either wore earplugs or they asked the manager to reduce the background noise.
Yeah, and I would add that a lot of the restaurants or several restaurants will not even engage an acoustic consultant. A lot of times it might just be an owner and an architect and a contractor, and that's it. So I think it's just, again, raising that awareness, or that educating architects that are coming up in the field, that always kind of drive the need for acoustics. That is really key. No matter how big or small the room, it's easy for a small room to get loud, and it doesn't take much. So I think it's just getting, making sure that there is an acoustic consultant involved is really the starting point.
Awesome. Thank you for those answers. The next question is one from Facebook. It says, architects usually design with their eyes, and it's time to start using our ears too, is what she suggests. Has there been done any, have you researched any with any inaudible frequencies? Has there been any inaudible frequency research?
Well, when I think about inaudible frequencies, I'm not sure that this is your question, Ada, but I think of a lot of the work with wind turbines, or the lower than we can hear, so lower than 20 hertz would be infrasound. And then there's also a group that does higher than we can hear, or ultrasound. So there are that research is happening. I don't see it as much, honestly, in the built environment, because often it's in the community that there's a wind turbine that's generating sound below 20 hertz. It's inaudible, and people are worried about how that is being perceived by members of the community. Or on the other end, there are devices that are ultrasonic that are used to prevent certain types of animals, for example, for congregating in areas. And then there is my younger kids can hear the bats in my attic because they could hear those higher frequencies, right? And so maybe the younger people would complain then if they're by a place where there's something like that. But I don't know of much of that research in restaurants or in buildings.
Either the other two have anything to say? I think Lily's answer was pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I don't have much.
Okay.
We haven't done any research in either of those spectrums. Yeah.
All right. So the next question is from Esteban Zanardi. He says, how accurate do you think computer simulations of restaurants are nowadays in regarding the in situ final situation? I think that's probably for you, Pierre, but any others can answer that one as well.
I haven't looked into any computer simulations myself, but it'd be really interesting to see, because just from our experiences, for instance, just the sound map of where in the restaurant it gets louder than others. Obviously, in some cases, if you're sitting next to a window in a concrete wall, it's going to get louder there just from that energy buildup versus in the center of the restaurant where you might have, you know, in the middle of carpeting, you might have some absorption above you and that sort of thing. So I think that's something, an area that I would be interested in, just seeing what simulations are out there, just so we can, you know, kind of help educate us in terms of where the treatment should go and where we should kind of focus the system a little bit.
Sure. Lily, I think you have some a little bit of background with some simulation techniques.
Yes, sure. And so definitely in the literature, there are studies where they have simulated dining spaces and then tried to calibrate them to the actual existing space. Because that's part of the problem with the computer simulation is how accurate can you can get the geometry pretty well, but how accurate can you get the material properties? And then how accurate can you get the source, right? You want all these different people gathered around a table talking in certain directions at different times. I think that's where the difficulty lies in using computer modeling right now as a predictive tool. You know, that we already have that problem predicting any type of space is how accurate can we get geometry is okay, but how accurate can we get the materials? How accurate can we model source materials? So I myself am not broadly aware of people using computer simulation for design, but as I said, I'm in a niche of academia and research. So, if there are, I'm just not as familiar with them.
I'll add my own perspective on this one. For my thesis, we did a lot of work with some simpler mathematical models that tended to do a pretty decent job of predicting the levels, at least trending in the correct direction, you know, relating to occupancy. So whereas they might not, you know, predict the absolute level of the restaurant entirely well, did a job of predicting it relative to the occupancy, how many people were in the restaurants. So.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that, Jared. That wasn't with a computer model. That was just with
Correct. It was just an equation.
An equation,
Yep.
right? Mm-hmm.
Yep, exactly. Cool. So that's the last Q&A question I have for now. Greg, we'll go back to accomplishments in the field that you're most proud of, if that's okay.
Yeah, I would say the three things we're most proud of. One is that we created a tool to help empower people who care about noise. So I think that's really important. I think people are inspired by that and they tell their friends and they get people to take these sound level measurements, and it just helps the industry overall. And then the other thing I'm proud of is from a data perspective, we're creating large, we have about 130,000 submissions so far. And that's a lot of data for researchers and for data to be used for potentially seeing what the typical sound level is. And then going forward, one of the things we really want to work on, particular to this audience, is really help use our data to give acousticians and acoustic suppliers leads to approach the restaurant and say, look, users care about how your sound levels are, they're making submission. And it helped give them a stamp of approval that, like, hey, they have a valid argument to make, as opposed to sometimes approaching these restaurants and educating them can be difficult. So that those are the things we're proud of.
Very cool, very cool. Lily?
Sorry, I sort of answered that a little earlier.
Yeah, you did a little bit.
Which was just to say that, yeah, I'm proud of the role that we play, that I do think it is a role that's needed in addition to Pierre's role and Greg's role and everyone who's participating on this. And frankly, your role too, Jared. You know, I guess I could also say I'm very proud of working with students who do great work and are helping to advance the field. So.
Very good. That's all of the questions I had, and it looks like all of the questions from the audience. Is there any last things that any of you wanted to mention that you thought was important that we didn't cover yet?
I see that Ed Logston put a comment in the chat. Ed, thank you for that you had used ease. Ed is a consultant, and that they had used computer modeling to predict how far a talker voice would go with and without treatment, not for absolute, but for reference. So this type of material versus this type of material. So thank you for sharing that.
All right, I'll welcome Fernando back to
Yeah.
do solutions and close out.
Yes, I would really like to thank this amazing panelists we had today with sharing our knowledge with us and giving such a good panel discussion on this very interesting and topic that I think will show increasing interest in the future, and we'll see many new things and stuff related to the acoustics of restaurant and how to improve the experience of dining out and also to improve the health of workers working in a restaurant. So I want to thank very much all the panelists for they did a wonderful job. I want to thank you, Jared, also for the excellent job you did at moderating this panel. And I would like to apologize for the slow beginning. It's difficult to coordinate having simultaneous translation. We had a couple of issues with the translation, but I guess in general it went well, and I want to thank you all for that. We made a good teamwork that really worked out. So thank you all very much, and stay tuned for for further events that we'll have with the Spanish-speaking Acousticians chapter in June. We'll have new events, and thank you all very much. Thanks from all my heart. Goodbye.
Thank you.